All right, everyone, I am showing the top of the hour. So Jackie, if you can go to the next slide, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. We know you have many choices when choosing your professional development activities, and there are some amazing opportunities here at the University of Arizona Global Campus and beyond. We are so happy that you chose to join us today as the UAGC Department of Education and Liberal Arts proudly presents to you Ed Talks. I'm Dr. Jessie Upshaw, and I'm honored to lead the Professional Development Committee of the Department of Education and Liberal Arts here at the UAGC College of Arts and Sciences. I will be your host this afternoon. Today marks our 8th session in the 2021 Ed Talk series entitled Multipliers, inspired by the study of the work of Liz Wiseman in her New York Times bestselling book, Multipliers: How the Best Leaders Make Everyone Smarter. Here to explore and extend Wiseman's foundational concept of dealing with diminishers with his story, no stranger to our regular Ed Talk participants, is our very own Dr. Jackie Kiger. As you listen to Jackie's story, you might listen for your call to action to share your practices that support a culture of leadership and the multiplier effect in your own classroom and your interactions with students and colleagues. Or perhaps you'll find a new practice that his story or our discussion sparks for you. Jackie, will you come on camera and say hello as I introduce you?
I certainly will. Hi, everybody.
Thanks, Jackie. Dr. Jackie Kiger has been teaching with UAGC for more than a decade, beginning in 2010, and has been working with the Master of Arts in Education program since 2013. Jackie has participated in every single Ed Talk as either a story coach, the presenter, or a host, and today we are honored to have him again as our storyteller. Here in the Dell, Jackie keeps very busy, and at the university level, he's a reviewer for IRB proposals, and he is the advisor for Salute, the Veterans National Honor Society, where he has a personal connection to our military students, as Jackie is a retired Coast Guard officer with more than 20 years military experience. If you want to hear more about those experiences, you might want to look up a copy of his recent book, The Coast Guard on the Texas Border. Thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Kiger.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Jackie, I'm going to now ask that we remove our videos so we can get started after a few brief reminders. As a reminder, Ed Talks are fashioned after TED Talks, the ever popular way of sharing personal stories for only 18 minutes of monologue. We do this because we want to hear your stories, and we can best do that by sharing our stories. Our goal here is not necessarily to teach you anything new, as you are already an expert in your field. Our goal is to perhaps motivate you to try something new or a new approach to your helping students to succeed. Our storytelling approach is geared to not take up a lot of your time, but rather to simply set the stage for an interactive conversation and perhaps encourage you to encourage your students in some new way. At the end of our Ed Talk today, we look forward to hearing your stories of what you're doing or will do in your classroom or your educational setting. After Jackie's story, we will invite all participants to share your reflection and practices. So with that said, audience members, if you could please hold your comments and chat to the end as we listen to Jackie's story. Jackie, the microphone is yours.
Well, thank you for being here, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Jessie. I hope the next 18 minutes of your time will be time well spent. As you listen to my story, be thinking about these 3 questions on the screen as we consider dealing with diminishers. That's the name of my topic for today, dealing with diminishers. It corresponds with a chapter in Liz Wiseman's book on multipliers. I found it interesting that Wiseman chose the word dealing. She did not go with the phrase winning over the diminisher or extinguishing the diminisher or even diminishes you fired. She went with deal with it, regarding how to respond to diminishing people. If her book is ever made into a motion picture movie, I'm sure they're going to call it The Diminisher Wears Prada. But if I'm being honest, I was surprised by that advice. Deal with it, Jackie. In last month's Ed Talk, Dr. Kathleen Pierce Friedman shared with us how the best intentions can lead to diminishing situations through her story on the accidental diminisher. I think if the world was full of accidental diminishers, Wiseman might have chosen a different verb than to deal with a certain type of diminisher, and what I've come to recognize as the intentional diminisher. Kathleen shared with us how to work with, and in many cases, correct or at least redirect and bring out the best in a would-be accidental diminisher. We see diminishing people everywhere. All we need to do is turn on the news, local or otherwise. How is your local news doing? Everything okay where you live? Or is there some lawyer in a commercial screaming at you to dial 444, 4444 because you've been diminished in some legal capacity and they are now going to be your superhero? If only you call, but you have to do it now. Time is running out. As I further considered Wiseman's advice, it brought me back to that whole other kind of diminisher out there who's not accidental at all, but rather intentional. They intentionally put up barriers, brick by brick, the intentional diminisher. We likely met this person early in our lives in the way of our mothers or someone in a parental capacity. No, you can't do that. Yes, you can go, but you have to take your sister. Be home by the time the street light comes on. I guess one could argue that I might be confusing my mother's caring nature for that of being intentional in diminishing my fun. My first experience with an intentional diminisher really was in my own backyard. But it wasn't my mother. It was my father, my stepdad, my dad. When I look back on my early childhood and interactions with my father, I wish I could make excuses for him in that his diminishing traits were accidental, but they were not. If I'm being honest, he was not a happy person. I think his mantra would have been, life is hard, deal with it. And being around him was something I learned to avoid. Avoidance. It turns out that Wiseman noted in her research that avoiding a diminisher was one of the 3 most popular ways that we choose to deal with them. Now, she's not suggesting that it was effective, just that it was popular. And actually, her research shows that of the 5 most popular things that we do in responding to the diminisher, 3 of those 5 are not very effective for the situation. So my response was to avoid him. And while I thought it worked, looking back now, his diminishing nature impacted who I was becoming, because I was becoming someone who wanted his approval. How I dealt with him was to avoid him. But you know, as a teenager, between school and work and avoiding him, I still wanted his approval. And while he was a lot of things that I did not want to identify with, my dad was a hard worker and he valued that work ethic. And I wanted his approval, so I valued it too. Actually, both of my parents had a very good work ethic. My dad was a teamster and worked in a factory that he worked long enough in that he retired from. My mother was a cook and worked in a hospital that she too retired from. Our family valued work. I knew that would win my father's approval. In my teens, from around the age of 13 through 19, a total of 7 years, and specifically through my high school years, I always had a job. Actually, I usually had more than one job. I washed dishes on weekends. On weeknights, I worked at a roller rink. On summer break, I hauled hay. On fall break, I picked up walnuts. And if we had a snow day, I shoveled snow for money. One summer, I had a route where I cleaned and emptied portable toilets. Leading up to the Thanksgiving holiday, I worked second shift at a turkey processing plant while in high school. Somewhere along the way, I washed cars, delivered coupon books, mowed yards. I eventually stopped going to high school for a full-time opportunity working at a car dealership's auto body repair shop. 2 years later, at 19, I joined the Coast Guard. I wanted my father's approval. I was making my own money. I was making my own way, but I still wanted the approval. Wiseman reminds us that spotting a diminisher and then dealing with a diminisher does not just impact one's work, but it can negatively impact our whole being. What I realize now, as an educated adult, is that I got caught up in seeking approval from a diminishing force rather than focus on what needed to be done, which was finish school. I focused on what I thought should be done. Remember, I was seeking approval. I was trying to operate in a light of acceptance. At no point did I consider how my dad could change, but rather, what did I need to do to get along? One day I came home and told my parents that I was going to join the Coast Guard. And all my dad said was, "You mess up a lot of things. Are you sure you want to mess with the government?" Now, to be fair, I had a lot of jobs and was a strong-willed, opinionated 19-year-old. So while my dad was diminishing, it was at the same time concerning. But in typical dad form, he went on to make some diminishing comment that I would not make it through boot camp anyway. And that is where I found my motivation. I can honestly tell you that as the government contracted bus pulled up through the boot camp gates, I remember thinking, I may very well die here, but I'm not going to give him the satisfaction of me quitting here. So I ventured off into a new direction and ran smack dab into my next life-altering diminisher, and he too was intentional in his diminishing. Bosun's mate, second class George Deacle, my company commander, the drill sergeant. He lived up to every cliche that I'd ever heard about drill sergeants. I'll bet you he slept in those mirrored sunglasses. And while only 5 foot something, he filled the room as if he were 10 feet tall. He was one loud person who loved to kick over trash cans when he entered a room. He was intimidating, and I avoided him. But in boot camp, there's no place to run. Certainly no place to hide, but I tried because that had become my MO. I remember my very first encounter with him was him screaming at me with questions about how far could I high port an M1. And something about had my mother sent me here just to make him angry because it was working or something like that. Just know you're getting the PG-13 audience version of that encounter. Turns out, high port means carrying a rifle over your head while running, and M1 is that rifle. I wish I'd known that prior to that first encounter with my drill sergeant. But I survived. Because what he did not realize was I had been raised by a diminishing person that hated trash cans as much as he did. So his disdaining nature of a drill sergeant was all too familiar for me. And between the familiarity and my avoidance, I made it through boot camp. Wiseman advises us that avoiding diminishers will not be effective, but she goes on to give us some good advice on how to deal with them. She begins by telling us it's impossible to diminish someone out of being a diminisher. You cannot fight fire with fire. Even with a dim view of what lies ahead, you have to be a multiplier. You have to multiply your way into a better relationship with that diminisher. If not, you continue in what she calls a death spiral versus a growth cycle. This is important because when people make us feel small, we don't do big things. When faculty make students feel small, students don't do big things. I have one more diminisher in my life that I want to tell you about, and I'll be quick about it. This goes back to my student days at my local community college. I was taking computer classes, but my basic courses required that I take a government class. It was the only class I had where my professor held a doctorate. Not that that was important, but it was an observation that I made. The class met once a week on Tuesday evenings for 3 hours for about 12 weeks or so. Every time the class convened in the early weeks, he would ask, "Would you like to take a break in the middle or skip the break and we'll wrap up before 10 p.m.?" Well, we all agreed getting out earlier was better than a break. He would get so caught up in his lecture that we neither broke nor left early. It was just 3 hours of him talking, and us writing. He never once pointed us to the textbook that had cost a lot of money and that I was lugging back and forth to class, but yet not once ever being asked to open or reference it. I finally asked in frustration, "Are we ever going to use the book? It was required and it was expensive." All he said to me, looking me up and down in a highbrow, "How dare you question my teaching," was, "Perhaps this class is not for you." And he continued his 3-hour no break lecture. I continued writing in hopes of capturing what might be on the final. I got a B in the class. I hated the class. What I didn't mention at the beginning regarding Wiseman's book is that it's in its second edition. It is now marketed as revised and updated with specifics on how to deal with the diminisher. That's the new part. Originally, she captured how diminishers impact intelligence and capability, but she admits to underestimating how pervasive the impact is in people's lives when they encounter diminishers. When people are being diminished, it's not just about their work. It's all-consuming. Diminishers, whether intentional or not, oftentimes can leave a person feeling bullied. I didn't like the way my government teacher made me feel. What I didn't realize then was my big lesson was not in government, but how will I choose to lead when I'm a teacher? So what about you as an educator? I've been sharing the importance of multiplying up in business relationships. But what about the business of leading our online classroom? What about our students? Wiseman reminds us that you multiply up by exploiting the person's strengths. You promote what it is that they do well to the effort at hand. You multiply up when you give them a user's guide on you. Is your profile page in your online course just a facts page? Or is it a guide for your students to see a bit more of you and understand you and embrace your expectations as a result of that better understanding of you? You multiply up when you listen to learn. We can learn so much from our students when we stop typing, stop talking, and just read and listen to what they have to say. And you multiply up when you admit your mistakes. It shows we are human and we're capable of not only making mistakes, but admitting that it's part of who we are, and that's okay. Students love seeing the real you. Wiseman advises to sign up for a stretch, which is to make it known you are someone who can take on more and do more than just the routine. As we consider our students, we need to be proactive in our professional development in such series as this, our Ed Talks. And thank you for being here. I think that when we feel we have nothing more to learn, that's probably our cue that we have nothing more to say in our teaching. Challenging oneself to learn more is a hallmark of those who make the classroom matter for their students. And lastly, Wiseman encourages us to invite them to the party. Be encouraging, be engaging, be inviting. Keep your students in the conversation with how you encourage and engage those discussions, emails, and even phone calls. Because if we don't, whether intentional or not, we may diminish our students' experience in learning. If we only care about APA format, our students miss a rich learning experience. My dad only cared about work. I missed a high school learning experience. If I manage only as a drill sergeant, well, I'll likely get compliance, but it's doubtful I'll ever foster commitment from my students. If all I ever do is talk, talk, talk in my classroom approach, then eventually no one is listening to what I have to say because they're too busy writing, writing, writing. By changing our response, we can change the dynamic of the relationship. I wanted my dad's approval. Students want your approval. If you use bricks to build paths for their journey, they know they're welcomed and respected. Wiseman says diminishers violate our sense of self-respect. Our students should never have to consider how to deal with us as a diminisher. Students want your relationship. Students want your approval. We all have bricks that make up our influence. Let's create paths of success, not walls to be avoided. Thank you.
Wow, Jackie, thank you so much for sharing that. When I listened to his journey and walking us through that path, I really can't help but think about my own journey through childhood, education, and adulthood, thinking about multipliers, the accidental diminishers, and as he mentioned, those intentional diminishers. But it also makes me shift to that view that our students must be experiencing as they're on their own paths, as they work their way to their class, to our classrooms. And what do I do to provide that multiplying environment rather than a diminishing one? Or how can I provide the skills to deal with diminishers so that when they leave the classroom, they have that to add to their tool belts? And where could this happen in my classroom? You see on the screen, if you're watching, that Jackie posed some questions for us to consider here as we reflect on our own practice, as we look through that lens of multipliers, and specifically how we can support our students to gain the skills to deal with diminishers. So the questions are, do you deal or do you avoid? What about your bricks? And how are you an intentional multiplier? As we open up the chat lines to consider your takeaways from today's story, let's frame our discussion. Start sharing your impressions or your ideas, or perhaps your new approach in the chat. Or we would love to hear from you. Share with us using your audio by simply raising your hand using the hand icon at the bottom of your screen. You'll then be given the opportunity to unmute your microphone and share your story and your reflection that way. We invite you to join the conversation and inspire others with your journey. I see Martin is saying you were diminishing attorneys there in your story, Jack.
Or I was just shining a light on them, Marty.
Holly mentions the differences between the first and second edition, and definitely getting more ideas and expanding our research is one way we can continue to multiply through. Oh, Holly, I see your hand is raised. Let me let you unmute.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you, Jackie. So one of my colleagues, Cliff Blizzard, we were talking about in a group meeting about win-win strategies. He says, well, if they're telling you that they can't do this particular thing, then he asked, well, what can you do? And I thought I would build on that by refocusing the entire group on how it would benefit students. And I like to say something like, I know we have the same intentions in mind, that the students have a rich experience when they encounter this course. And then I would use Clifford's question. You can't do this. Well, what can you do? That's what I had to say. Thank you.
I love that, Holly. Thank you so much for sharing and how that fits into providing that model of multiplying.
I appreciate that, Holly. And that's typical Cliff. Having been in several of his book clubs in the past year, certainly appreciate his contributions and what he brings to it. And along those lines, I know for me, as an example, you'll get an email where a student will ask you for an extension, and it'll kind of be poised about how much time can you give me to get this paper in, and I'll always turn it around and say, certainly we can work on an extension here, but I need you to tell me when you'll have it done. And to my surprise, oftentimes they don't need as much time as I was thinking. And when you put that in their hands, you know what, you're also putting that in their control. And so it doesn't lose sight that they're dependent on me to be successful. They're dependent on themselves to be successful. And it's my job to help facilitate that and to Cliff's point, ask the right questions.
Julie is bringing up in the chat here how the "what can you do" that Clifford speaks to is very similar to Dr. Donna Beagle's work and discussing meeting students where they are, not where you think they are, but where they are. And it provides that opportunity for support with supporting those bricks, the positive ones, and pulling them over the wall. I think Dr. Newton Miller shared a visual in one of the presentations he's given, where are you actually reaching down and helping somebody over the wall, or rather than waiting to see if they climb up. And that comes to mind when I'm thinking of this too.
Thanks, Den. I appreciate your comment. And that was my hope here with this talk. Not to give a bleeding heart story about me and my dad's relationship. We ended up fine. But to our own awareness, I'm guilty of it. I teach entry point classes on the graduate side. And so I'm like an APA policeman. And, let's talk about that for a minute. Have you ever been pulled over by a traffic stop by a policeman? And you get the gruffy encounter of, do you know why I pulled you over? Or do you get the approaching officer who's like, is everything okay? Because I noticed yada, yada, yada. And the whole thing changes. Well, I have to do that. If all I am is the APA police, I turn off good writing. And APA is important, and I want to hold them to that standard. But if that's all I'm a talking head about, I think they probably avoid me at some point, and that's not what we want.
I'm thinking of intentional multiplying here, especially in the face of diminishers. I think we've got a few levels to think of us as our own instructional practices in the classroom. How can we be intentional? Holly has given some examples, and Julie and several others here in the chat of how to do that in the classroom, but also building those skills of, by being an intentional multiplier in the classroom, what are we showing our students about being leaders in their field? Whether that's in marketing, or that's in early childhood education, or that's in psychology, or wherever they're headed when they leave, cross that stage, hopefully in person in spring, and graduate. Where are they going, and what type of leader are they going to be, and what impact do we have on that?
We think about our bricks. Our bricks are good things. My example of APA, I'm the APA guy. Okay, great. I'm sure you all are too. So am I stacking that up so that they can't climb around it? Or am I presenting it in such a fashion that they're able to walk across it and kind of build on where they're headed, and that they're appreciative for that brick advice, because it ended up being a stepping stone and not a bulkhead or something that they bump their head on as a result of that. So I think we have to be intentional. The other thing I think we have to be fair about is that we don't just give all of our bricks away, because sometimes they don't need them. And Kathleen talked about that last month also. And it's made me rethink, how much stuff do I want to put in my opening week preview announcements, in the way of exemplars, in the way of, hey, use this tool, hey, use that tool. And okay, I'll be quiet because Kathleen raised her hand, and then I'll get back to it here. The microphone is yours.
No, Jackie, well, thank you for the shout out. But your talk made me think about the APA side of it. And I also teach an entry level course, and I am an APA police. And is that really serving my students to get them to the next course? Or am I diminishing them by hounding them over APA when that is just a small factor in them getting to their end goal, their career goal? So thank you for that.
And I agree. And we don't diminish it. We don't dismiss it. But again, if that's all I'm talking to them about, then I miss the context of what the topic should have been. You know, as an example, classroom management is one of the things we talk about in my class that I teach. And so if all they hear from me is that talking head APA point of view, they're no longer, you know, it goes back to what I said. I'm talking, and they're no longer listening to what I have to say.
So true, Jackie and Kathleen. Thank you so much for sharing that reflection. Martin, I see in the chat just that parallel to the golden rule. Treating others the way we want to be treated, responding to a question much more positively than a challenge or a comment that is speaking down. You know, some of us may have had very multiplying instructor experiences throughout our educational path. Some of us may have had those instructors that said, I had to do this when I was where you are, so now you're going to have to do it too. And that often comes to mind. And in Jackie's story, when he was talking about that higher ed experience, you know, I've had instructors on both sides, and it is you're going to respond more positively and then unlock so much more potential when you're supporting and asking rather than more of the putting bricks in their way. Thank you, Martin.
It's a very good point about the golden rule. You know, we have a saying where I'm from, you know, count your Christmas cards. That'll tell you what kind of a neighbor you are at the end of the year. Count your Christmas cards. Count how many times students reach out to you and ask you for a letter of reference when they're done. You know, I had them in an entry point, so it's a while before they graduate, and it's nice when they reach back to you, and not necessarily to ask for a letter of reference, which some do, but just to let you know that they made it, and they were done with my course a long time ago, but it's nice. I count that as a success when I hear that they've reached out to let me know that they're graduating in the fall.
Well, it looks like our chat is winding down, and all good things do come to an end. But before you go, please go ahead and draw your eyes to the chat box. If you're here with us live, there should be a link that should be appearing right now to our Ed Talks homepage. Jackie can go to the next slide. This recorded Ed Talk will be archived there for future viewing, along with certificates of participation. And you'll also be able to find that link to the Ed Talks homepage in today's invitation if you need it, rather than writing it down really fast. Next slide, please, Jackie. We do want to acknowledge yet again the work of Liz Wiseman in her Multipliers book for the inspiration for today's Ed Talk, as well as the rest of our series this year. And speaking of the next session, we have 2 sessions coming up. Please join us in 2 weeks at UAGC's 2021 TLC conference on November 2nd for a very special student perspective from the multiplier perspective, and come back and see us for our final 2021 session on November 18th, same time, same place, where Dr. Tisha Shipley shares the story of becoming a multiplier. We thank you so much for joining us today. A huge thank you again to Dr. Jackie Kiger for sharing with us today his inspiration and next steps for supporting our students and for supporting each other. And on behalf of our Dean, Dr. Tony Farrell, and UAGC's Department of Education and Liberal Arts, we wish you a very safe and healthy and impactful October, and we'll see you next month. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate you making time.